let me know when we can start.
So the audience is joining. If you like, we can wait for a minute, or we can
sure.
start given on your choice.
Sure.
So
we'll wait for a minute and then we can start.
Surely, sir. Sure.
So maybe we'll start.
Sure, sir. We are ready to go, sir.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar by IIM Ahmedabad NSE Policy Center, where we're going to discuss policy uncertainty and the behavior and its impact on foreign firms. This is a center that is a partnership between IIM Ahmedabad and NSE, National Stock Exchange, as the name suggests. And the main purpose of the center is to enhance research on behavioral insights on how, on the decision making on the part of people. So the center conducts a lot of research on, for instance, how to nudge people towards certain decisions. How do you, how do people behave when it comes to their investment decisions? In this discussion, Arvind has also joined us. So Arvind, I'll let you introduce the center, if you will, and then we can take over from there. Hi, Arvind. Okay, so if that is the case, then I think maybe I'll quickly wrap up the introduction and then we can get going. So two of us are going to engage in the discussion on the policy uncertainty and the impact it has on foreign firms. One is, this is me, Vishwanath Pingali, who is an associate professor in the economics area at IIMA. I teach a lot of courses on microeconomics and game theory here at IIMA. And my research interests are primarily on healthcare and digitization. And this paper that I'm going to talk about to you today, around which I think the discussion would be centered, is a co-authored work with one of my colleagues and another friend on this topic of policy uncertainty. And Akhilesh, by the way, is with NIIF currently, and also an alum of IIM Ahmedabad, a very proud alum, I must say, of IIM Ahmedabad. So therefore, Akhilesh, I'll let you introduce yourself as well, and I think we can kick the proceedings forward.
Thank you, Professor Pingali. An honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you for this invite. As Professor Pingali mentioned, I am an alumni of IIMA, currently working with the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, NIIF in Mumbai. Prior to this, I've also worked with the Government of India as an officer of special duty with the Union Minister, which gives me some exposure to policy making and the world of how policy gets shaped. Not necessarily always with the intent of bringing in uncertainty, but I think that'll be an interesting topic to discuss today. Prior to this, I've worked extensively in the financial services ecosystem and have also been a consultant with the Boston Consulting Group earlier when I got out of campus. I've also published a couple of books which deal with the macro picture in India. So I have a broad sense of things that I have some interest and understanding of.
Okay, so without further ado, Akhilesh, then in that case, I'll kickstart the proceedings in the sense that I'll share my PPT very quickly. Maybe I'll walk through the PPT and introduce what I meant by policy uncertainty and how foreign firms are impacted and why should they be impacted any differently. I'll cover a whole swathe of questions. Then I'll, at any given point in time, if you think that there's a point that you could add, please feel free to jump in. And I think as you keep discussing your part of the story, I'll do the same. in the sense that we can make it a conversation as against two monologues stitched together kind of a story, right? I mean, so let me quickly share my screen and then we can get going. Is my screen visible? I hope, right? So let me start. So this paper, as I said, is a joint work between with two of my friends and colleagues. One is Professor Amit Khanna, who is a professor in the strategy area. Another is Shami Mondal, who is currently working as a faculty in Bangalore. So the original thought process for this paper really comes from this very simple quote by Vijay Shekhar Sharma, I guess. I mean, the founder of Paytm, who ended up saying that, his unique advantage in this market, probably when compared to international players, is probably the fact that he knows the local ecosystem, the local terrain a little bit better in every sense of the word. So now let's actually come to the main research questions that we have addressed here. What happens when firms face with policy uncertainty in the emerging markets? Why is emerging markets as a context important? I think that's the first question that we need to say, because, emerging markets by their very definition means that the markets have not yet arrived in every sense of the word, and many policies are still shaping up. So therefore, policy uncertainty in its very definition is one of the inherent problems that emerging markets face. I'm not saying that everything is policy uncertainty, but policy uncertainty definitely has to be a feature, I would argue, of the emerging markets. And then we'll actually argue that policy uncertainty is not necessarily equally faced by every firm. We would specifically say that that foreign firms will look at it differently from the domestic firms. I mean, the way I look at it is as follows. I think while I'll elaborate on it a little bit more, the way I look at it is as follows. For a firm that is, born and brought up, born and nurtured in an emerging market, policy uncertainty becomes a part of their DNA, in the sense that they will begin to anticipate some of these unanticipatable, if you will. Whereas a foreign firm, on the other hand, is a little bit more attuned to structured decision making. So that's where I would actually say that adapting to the new ecosystem would be a fair bit of a challenge for the foreign firms. So therefore, that's where policy uncertainty will probably end up creating a different level playing field between foreign firms and domestic firms. Now, what do you expect of smart set of individuals, which these foreign firms are? If you're faced with a problem once, well, you'd suffer. But if you're faced with the problem twice, you actually know how to react to it better. So therefore, if you take this old cliche that you'll actually learn by doing a little bit forward, then you actually understand that these foreign firms will start, those that operate in emerging markets, will start looking at how to deal with policy uncertainty. Maybe one way to do it is mimicking the behavior of the local firms in some sense. Maybe another way of doing it is basically, honing up their anticipatory skills a little bit, maybe not giving out knee-jerk reactions like they would do earlier, et cetera, et cetera. So therefore, they would adapt to policy uncertainty significantly better over a period of time. So therefore, the fundamental argument that we're trying to make is policy uncertainty creates a non-level playing field between various firms in the market. But not only that, that level playing field starts easing out as the time keeps progressing. I think that seems to be the main message that we seem to be looking at. Now, the context of this paper is the Indian pharmaceutical industry. Indian pharma market has undergone a fair bit of change in the recent times. In early 2000s, the pharma market has gone through two shocks, actually. One is what I call as drug price control order. What does drug price control order do? Drug price control order caps the prices of all essential medicines. Now, we call this as an anticipated shock because the firms knew that the shock was coming. Why did the firms know that the shock was coming? A couple of years before DPCO came through, drug price control order came through, a list was published. It is called as National List for Essential Medicine, which was a massive thing, actually. So therefore, everyone knew that the prices of the drugs that are present in NLEM are more likely to be regulated. What form and shape the regulation is going to take, well, that's a little bit of a mystery, I guess. But I mean, that remained a little bit of a mystery, I guess. But even if there, it is fairly straightforward to actually guess. But I think the fact that some price cap is coming on them was fairly well known in the pharma circles. So that's why we call it as anticipated shocks. How do firms react to anticipated shocks? I mean, there's a particular proven way. You anticipate the consequences of every action possible and pick the best possible action. Those of us who have studied decision making will call this as game tree approach, or whatever, what have you, backward induction. These are the various technical terms. We as academics every once in a while like to throw in a lot of jargon at unsuspecting people. So the backward inductions, subgame perfections, all these are the jargons that one would throw in. But when there is an anticipated shock in the market, we would assume that foreign firms and domestic firms, their reaction will not be too different from each other. Now, while be that as it may with DPCO, the DPCO contains a paragraph. It is the 19th paragraph of the order, so that's why it's called as paragraph 19. The government ended up saying that should there be a need to impose restrictions on some other drugs which are deemed nationally important. I would argue the government says that they're going to impose them, the price restrictions on them. Now, how does this work? At some point in time, on a few molecules, the government ended up imposing price restrictions. This came, which are not a part of NLEM. This came as a complete surprise to the pharma market, and therefore, I think it's fair to say that we would call this as unanticipated shock to the market. Now, here is where our juxtaposition happens. In the first case, how did foreign firms react? How did domestic firms react? We argue that they are identical. In the second case, on the other hand, how did foreign firms react and how did domestic firms react? Our argument is that domestic firms actually started reacting much better to policy uncertainty than the foreign firms did. So that's where it is. I mean, I think, are the results here that we are actually saying limited to pharmaceutical markets? That's $1 million question. I mean, is it really a quintessential pharma market feature? I would actually argue that some of these results are extrapolatable. I don't know if such a word exists, or extrapolable, whatever the case may be, to other industries as well. For instance, mutual fund industry. It's going through a lot of policy uncertainty. I mean, it's going through a lot of policy shifts in the sense that, who can hold equity, what can you invest in, what are the various rules that are there in investing, et cetera, et cetera. So will that actually affect everything equally? Both the foreign fund houses, as well as the domestic fund houses in an identical way, or will, a domestic fund be able to withstand these policy uncertainties much better than the foreign fund? I mean, I'm really not sure, actually. I mean, this is worth investigating, but my sense is that our results will carry forward as well. I think, the greatest example of policy uncertainty that has been unleashed in recent times, and I really hope it will never happen again, at least not in my lifetime, would be the pandemic. Pandemic, nobody had a playbook on how to deal with pandemic. So therefore, many governments started reacting in several ways. And I think, to me, that's where, many of the changes that the government was talking about, very difficult to anticipate. So therefore, I assume that in the coming days, policy uncertainty is going to be a feature, not just of emerging economies like we do here, even for the developed economies. So therefore, I actually do believe, so Trump visa policies, for instance, right? I mean, another classic case of policy uncertainty where the statement changes by the second. So I think these are some of the things that we're talking about as far as policy uncertainty is concerned. How do firms actually withstand this policy uncertainty? So that's what I think I'll end up talking to you quickly. And the context, as I said, is the pharmaceutical market space. And again, we follow a tradition called branded generics, which essentially means that even for the most generic of medicines, so for example, paracetamol, I can rattle out 3-4 brand names without even thinking: Crocin, Dolo, Calpol, Metacin, 6 other variants at least. I mean, all of them are identical in their chemical composition, but they come with a brand name. Make sense? So therefore, what happens is it gives an incentive for the pharma companies to actually send their medical representative to the doctor to even canvass for the drugs which are very well known, and therefore drive up the demand for their brand, not necessarily for the molecule. They would go and tell the doctor, listen, by the way, paracetamol is a much better fever relieving medicine than ibuprofen, for instance. Not only paracetamol's demand drums up, the med rep would go and tell the doctor, please prescribe crocin within paracetamol. So therefore, crocin's demand would. So even if metacin were a little cheaper, can it be possible that doctor is still prescribing crocin? Answer is probably yes. So therefore, the incentive behind this particular law is to actually cut that perverse incentive and cap the prices out significantly, right? So that's where I think we are. That's where I think this law like a DPCO comes in. Now the question is, how has the law been implemented? Right? I mean, the answer is very simple. Take the prices of every medicine, of every brand for that molecule. Take a simple average and say this shall be the price. My understanding from the industry is that they kind of guessed that when this law was going to come and what the formula that was going to be used was. Right. So, for example, crocin, Dolo 650 mg paracetamol. Now you take crocin 650, Dolo 650, metacin 650, and all the other brands of paracetamol 650 mg. Take a simple average and say that this is going to be the price beyond which you cannot charge as far as the medicine is concerned. My understanding from the industry is that they had a clue that this was the case. I mean, there was a recent IMS McKinsey report that got published, which basically said that just before the implementation of this law, the medicine prices in India actually went up. Obviously, so when the average price is taken, naturally average is not really that bad. So these are some of the issues. I'm not saying that I have noticed it. I'm just saying that these are the reports that we've actually seen happen, that have been published in more than one sense of the word. Yeah, so let's move on. Now, the whole other argument would be there are some other issues which are also kind of funny. 250 mg medicine was not regulated, but 500 mg was regulated. Suddenly your dosage is being doubled. I mean, in the sense that instead of taking one tablet, the doctor is prescribing to you 2 tablets, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, 250 mgs, because that's where the incentives are. So therefore, when you talk about DPCO, while in the spirit it is a great one, in the details, I think you see that there are issues which basically had several perverse incentives, for the pharma companies as well as for the medical practitioner. So therefore, what are the restrictions like these on price? There are several papers, including mine own, that I published in 2015 along with 2 of my other friends, which showed that when price restrictions, which are supposedly favorable to the consumers, are imposed on the markets, the welfare consequences are not always in favor of the consumer, because the firms get strategic as well. And when the firms get strategic, welfare consequences can move either ways. So that's the whole context. Paragraph 19, I'd already explained. There were some other drugs on which the same formula was applied, which were not a part of original NLEM. This caught many pharmaceutical companies completely off guard. So what are the main points of investigation? Just to reiterate ourselves, do domestic and foreign firms react similarly to anticipated shocks? The answer is yes. Do domestic and foreign firms react similarly differently for unanticipated shocks? Answer is no. Do foreign firms adapt over a time to withstand policy shocks a little better? Of course, yes. So that's, I think, in short, what this paper, what we were trying to talk about is all about. So let me quickly go. Why should foreign firms go about talking to you about why foreign firms should react differently? The very famous argument in this case, almost every strategy student would read this, is this Palepo and Khanna paper that came out in Strategic Management Journal in 2010, which basically talked about the fact that institutional structures are different in different countries, and they're still emerging as far as developing economies are concerned, emerging economies are concerned. So maybe the word emerging actually comes from the fact that social institutions are still emerging in these countries, actually. So therefore, while one firm is used to emerging social structures, the other firm is not necessarily. The other very interesting paper in this is where they talk a lot about schemas, schema being a way in which a firm would react. I mean, let's say, for the lack of better word, I'd call schema being standard operating procedure that the firm would kick in, etc., etc. Different regulatory frameworks, maybe schema, maybe that's a right word, framework for different economies. So that's where the whole argument lies in. One firm is used to policy uncertainty, it is in the DNA. Another firm is not used to policy uncertainty, they're used to bit of structure. So therefore, that's the whole reason why they end up reacting differently. What's our first hypothesis? The first hypothesis is there's no real different adverse reaction. First sub-hypothesis would be foreign firms would have very serious reaction to policy uncertainty than the domestic firms. What about learning over time? There's a very beautiful paper by Solomon and Wu, again, 2012. I forget, is it Journal of Management or Strategic Management Journal? It's called institutional isomorphism. The whole argument of institutional isomorphism is that when you go to a new market, you tend to mimic the existing players significantly more. Now, imagine that a foreign firm comes to India, it starts mimicking the Indian firm processes. Now, can you do it straight off the bat tomorrow morning? You need to know first how the domestic firms actually react and start mimicking that particular process. This takes time. So therefore, foreign firms have the ability to learn over a period of time. And the other one is this very interesting classic, which talks about how firms learn by doing, essentially. Local conditions, etc., etc. They learn over time by learning and doing and failing, essentially. So therefore, while today the reaction may be a little bad, 10 years later, the reaction may be more focused and sharp, right? And that's where I would actually form our third hypothesis. When compared to new entrants, foreign firms with greater experience in emerging economy reacts less adversely to policy uncertainty. I think before this webinar, when Akhilesh and I were talking, he actually gave an entirely nice structure to this entire thing. When he actually said it's a series of natural experiments, right? I mean, when you look at it, DPCO is well known. Para 19 is an quasi-natural experiment of sorts in the sense that it has been imposed. So you have some period of it where cleanly no policy uncertainty, some period where there is serious policy uncertainty, so you can compare. Similarly, as far as Indian pharma companies are concerned, you also have a natural experiment. 2005 is a pivotal time point. Before 2005, Indian intellectual property schema is completely different. You never had product patenting. You only had process patenting, blah, blah, blah. Post 2005, you have huge amount of influx of foreign firms into India, thanks to more liberalization happening in terms of our practices vis-a-vis the international practice. So therefore, again, you have another natural experiment saying that there are those old entrants, there are new entrants. There is policy uncertainty, there is no policy uncertainty. So therefore, it gives you a nice little, the management professors love this term 2x2 matrix to actually think about anticipated, unanticipated policy uncertainty versus policy certainty. You have old firms and new firms. How is the reaction different across different cells of the 2x2 matrix, right? So yeah, so let me quickly look at it. How do we actually estimate this policy uncertainty reaction? We use proxy called sales, monthly sales of a molecule as a proxy for how firm behaves in the market, the end of the day. What are the various things that we look at? Our main variable of interest is sales. Our variables that we actually control for are product diversity, how many other molecules the firm manufactures, pre-price control market share, to just look at how dominant the firm is. Here is where we start looking at how we model policy uncertainty. For the period before DPCO was introduced, the variable called anticipated shock takes value 0. And once DPCO is introduced, the variable takes value 1. Similarly, how do we measure unanticipated shock? For all the time period, our data starts somewhere in 2007, I believe, and ends at 2000. 18-ish. So all the time period that is till para 19, the value takes the variable takes value 0. After that, after para 19 has been imposed, the variable takes value 1. Right? Similarly, the molecules that came under DPCO, the molecules that did not come under DPCO, para 19 molecules and non-para 19 molecules. Now, what are the variables that we are very, interested in? What we do is what we call is fixed effects regression. What essentially it means is it's looking for endogenous for kind of a variation within a molecule itself. So let's not get into the technical jargon here. I wouldn't kind of bore you with econometric details. What estimation strategy we look at is we look at the change in the sales of a foreign firm and domestic firm before and after imposition of DPCO. How do I measure that? Just basically multiplication of these 3 dummies when DPCO was introduced, multiplied by the molecules on which the DPCO was introduced, multiplied by whether the firm is a foreign firm or not. Remember, even if one of them is 0, the value becomes 0. So therefore, if the regression coefficient of this variable, foreign multiplied by DPCO time period is statistically significant or not statistically significant, you know that our hypothesis 1 is valid. Right? Similarly for para 19. Now, here is what our results are showing in every sense of the word. When we look at the, at this variable, minus 0.04, right at the bottom, the 3-way interaction variables, you see that for foreign firms which have looked at anticipated shock for DPCO molecules, the reaction is adverse, but the adverse reaction is very minor and it is not statistically significant at all. Sales go down by 4%, but we cannot differentiate, we cannot rule out the fact that it could have been 0. On the other hand, when you look at the reaction of foreign firms, you can see my cursor, I'm assuming on what I'm pointing out to right now. Or maybe now you can see it, foreign firm that face uncertain shocks, but they are with para 19 molecules. You actually can see that their sales go down by roughly 20%, and it is statistically significant. To me, this is the clinching evidence that says that when policy uncertainty is present, foreign firms are much more adversely affected. Their sales go down. So in other words, what is happening is while the firm is not allowed to exit as per the rules that the government has laid down, what I would do is I'll start employing less and less amount of medical reps to go and canvass the doctor to prescribe my molecule. So therefore, what is going to happen? The share of voice in front of the doctor goes down significantly. And therefore, you actually see that foreign firms sell less amount of drugs when faced with policy uncertainty. As far as policy certainty is concerned, let me actually point out one thing about the limitation. We are really not able to estimate the impact of policy, of DPCO on our sales. What we can say is that DPCO might have reduced the sales of that particular molecule, but there is really no difference between how much a foreign firm scaled down vis-a-vis how much a domestic firm scaled. Para 19, on the other hand, yes, foreign firms scale down. Domestic firms scale down. Probably domestic firms scale down. But foreign firms scale down significantly more. That's the whole argument that we would like to kind of point out. See, for example, anticipated shock multiplied by DPCO molecule is negative. So therefore, sales have reduced. But you cannot. But the whole argument is the impact is uniform on all the firms. Unanticipated shocks, everything, sales have reduced. But the impact is more on foreign firms. How do we test for this hypothesis of the third one, which is learning by doing? We actually look at it, as I said, now we add new variable, pre-2005, which is what we call as old firms, post-2005, which are our new firms. Now, okay, I mean, you may say, why am I doing this? Why can't I look at the age of the firm itself and do all this? Let me just be clear. We've done all kinds of robustness checks. We are not reporting it in this presentation, but the paper has all these details. And I think the editor and a couple of referees have thought that this is much clean way of presenting our main results. So therefore, there's a lot of other results that we have done. We've done the robustness checks, but we've not reported it in anywhere in the paper. So whether I take the age of the firm in India, or whether I look at it as pre-2005 and post-2005, I don't think it has any bearing as far as our results are concerned. I think the picture here is very, very clear. You can see that foreign late entrant, foreign early entrant, para 19 onset. You can see that the sales are completely changing. Completely changing. You can see that the late entrant has tanked completely. Whereas whereas the domestic and the foreign late entrant and the domestic late entrant, sales have been very, very, very stable post para 19 entry as well. So that means, what does this tell us? And of course, we back it up with very solid regressions as well. This negative number, minus 0.782, as well as minus 0.915. It tells you essentially that the new entrant simply has no choice in policy uncertainty. You can really clearly see it here. The left panel compares how the foreign late entrant behaves in terms of its sales, average sales, vis-a-vis your foreign early entrant. And the right panel shows how the late entrant foreign behaves vis-a-vis domestic firms, domestic late entrant. You can see the difference very, very clearly. And that's the whole argument, which is also backed up by regression. So what do these results tell us? I think this is something that I have been talking a lot whenever I talk to an MNC nowadays, is that the conversion of Indian firms into MNC culture is probably one of the most dangerous things that you could do when you're operating within India. You got to be more discerning. I think the local talent brings something to the table. So that local talent, local decision making, in every sense of the word, ought to be preserved if you want to battle policy uncertainty significantly more. I mean, there are a few limitations as well. I think one of the things that we kind of ignore is what is this firm's exposure to policy uncertainty in other emerging economies. What do I mean by this? Before entering India, have they had experience in other foreign countries? And if they did have experience in other foreign countries, is it possible that that they are actually moderating their expectation in India significantly better? I mean, so for example, if a firm had experience in China, or if the firm had experience in Brazil and then later moves to India, is it able to adapt better? I mean, the answer is I really don't know. I think that'll be the next whole argument. The other thing that I actually am interested in knowing is, and I think it's worth investigating at some point in time, and I'll also let Akhilesh take a stab at it at some point, is this. When Trump started announcing visa restrictions, and I think that rules were changing by the day and all that stuff, who adapted better? Is it Infosys, which is an Indian firm located in the US? Or maybe one can doubt it, maybe TCS, which is an Indian firm located in the US? Or is it an IBM, which is a foreign firm located in US, which is a US firm located in US, who has actually withstood policy uncertainty in developed countries better? Is it the firm from emerging economies, or is it firms from the advanced economies itself, or developed economies itself, right? I mean, so I don't know the answer to it. These are the areas which I believe are interesting avenues that we'll need to work at. So I'll actually stop here. Thanks for listening so far. And I think, Akhilesh, please go ahead and I'll stop sharing, and you can share your perspective as well. And I think we can probably have some discussion.
No, thank you. This was fascinating. I'd read the paper, but it is always useful to hear it from the author once again. You get to get a good sense of perspectives. And incidentally, the point where you ended, I was making down some of my notes as you were talking about this. That was exactly the question that I noted, that when an Indian firm then goes out and develops into some of these so-called developed economies or more stable economies in that sense, do they then get an advantage? And if they do, potentially there is something interesting for us to think about as many of Indian companies go international. Having said that, let me quickly talk about a few things that I have seen play out on the policy making side, and try and also give some sense on where we have seen what is it that the foreign firms have done to become more local in that sense. What I will talk about a lot more is, given my own field of work is a lot more on macro. I will talk about some of the more macro policy changes that took place, or a bunch of fiscal policy changes that took place, and then try and talk about some sources of policy uncertainty and whether these are unique to emerging markets or not. So if you think about the last few years, where have been some sources of anticipated policy changes? And if I look at it from a macro perspective, 3-4 big things come to mind. One is, for example, the government has been very clear about its investment pipelines or the monetization pipelines, and they've spoken about the intent to either disinvest or create new sort of infrastructure, etc. On the ESG side, for example, in the entire climate change with the net zero announcements, etc., there have been policy moves which are far more anticipated, and I think the industry can then begin to move towards the sort of policy direction that is being set by the government. India has also created some interesting regulatory architecture with Gift City coming up as an offshore center. So some of these have been things which have been in the works for the long time, and the industry has a sense of it. And these are in some sense anticipated policy changes. But there have been a few unanticipated policy changes also that have taken place in the last few years. I think among the larger one has been demonetization, which came rather suddenly, completely unanticipated. Then just before COVID, there was an income tax cut that had taken place, especially for manufacturing firms, new manufacturing firms that had come together. And eventually post COVID, also the PLI schemes, etc., began to come in, which is to incentivize more manufacturing, etc., to take place. And again, you mentioned this point about COVID itself being a huge uncertain event where a lot of policy changes took place. That again was unanticipated, and many of the policy stances that were taken, whether on fiscal, monetary side, etc., were unanticipated. I think what is important to think about as we reflect back and abstract out on what causes this unanticipated changes, there are 3 things that I could sense on where this policy uncertainty comes through. One is simply the prerogative of the executive, and to some extent this demonetization is just a prerogative of the executive, because in a sense there is a particular outcome that the executive wants to achieve. There is a particular policy pathway that they choose, and that can lead to policy decision with the policy uncertainty, because the pathway may not be something which is anticipated. The second is a timing related surprise. It's something that potentially that is a good thing to do. Tax changes, yes, maybe they should come down, maybe they should incentivize, etc. You didn't expect it. It suddenly came out of the blue, let's say in a September conference as opposed to in the budget. Again, is this positive, negative, can depend on what the actual policy is, but that can bring in the element of surprise or uncertainty as we spoke about. And finally, there is exogenous. It is not as if the policymaker is intent on making a choice or an uncertainty, but the external environment, whether it is the global financial crisis that happened, the COVID pandemic that happened, the taper tantrum that happened, for example, a bunch of these could be just exogenous shocks. And sometimes policymakers are just forced to react to some of these. Now, if we reflect back on this, one of the things that we see is that in general, the government and policymakers try and create forums where some of these are aired out. Some policy decisions, before they become decisions, the policy options get aired out, whether it is in forums, whether this is in industry committees, whether these are associations, representations, academic conversations like these. Some trial balloons on policies in general tend to get floated, and then at least some sort of formal and informal feedback is taken. And that process in general works. Sometimes it doesn't work, as we've seen in some of these cases that we discussed. But there is some method to the madness sometimes that it comes to when it talks about policy making in that sense. I think what is important to also note, and it is an interesting point that you made about emerging market economies. I think one of the things that we have seen with respect to policy uncertainty is also in the calendar year 22 with the Russia-Ukraine situation. a lot of economies have had to go into significant number of policy changes. And if you look back at only one big thing with respect to climate change and green conversations that were happening before the Ukraine invasion and after, where energy security became more important than climate security for the developed world, in a sense, there was a significant sense of policy uncertainty that got created. Now, in many cases, again, that is an exogenous shock and policymakers are responding to that exogenous shock. I think it is worth reflecting on whether all these three sources of uncertainty, the prerogative of the executive, the timing, as well as these exogenous shocks, are unique to emerging markets, or they are slightly more broad-based, but they tend to get more pronounced in the emerging market ecosystem. So that's something to think about. Of course, one important change or difference in an emerging market in general is that it grows much more faster. And by definition, the old framework has to change to a new framework, and that continues to evolve. So is, again, one of the reasons for policy uncertainty that the old things need to be broken a lot more in an emerging market and new ones created. So those are some initial thoughts on what we've seen take place. I'll pause for a bit in case you have any inputs or comments on it. I do have some thoughts on how I have seen, at least on the investment management side, firms react to this and how they adapt to this, but happy to pause for a minute.
Great, Akhilesh. I think this is also something that I've been thinking as you're talking. While my paper has been heavily on the negative shock, it's by no means true that policy uncertainty is only negative all the time. You mentioned something like PLI, which was also something, for instance, semiconductor policy, recent semiconductor policy announced out of blue. Everyone knows something is in the works, but I think the magnitude and all that stuff has taken the industry by surprise. So therefore, there could be positive shocks as well. I mean, I'm not saying that PLI is positive. The jury is still out there. It could be positive. Mostly some preliminary research shows it is, but it's still not conclusive. So therefore, there are policy shocks which are positive in nature. But, so here is where my hypothesis would be, and I'd like for you to see if you can comment on. My hypothesis is, given the fact that multinationals are exposed to larger markets, larger practices, etc., when the shock is positive, a multinational's reaction, a foreign firm's reaction could be much more swift and much more beneficial than a domestic firm's reaction could be, especially in an emerging market context. Because, as you said, the advanced economies are built on, the so-called advanced economies are built on series of great policies which have led to the growth of their industries. So it's in their DNA to anticipate good things about policy and react to it very, very fast. That would be my hypothesis. I wonder what your thoughts are on that before I'll actually bring in one of the questions from the audience, which I think is interesting. Yeah.
So that is an interesting point as to when there is a positive policy shock or when the industry environment becomes more positive because of policy, can the foreign capital flood in? And the example that comes to mind is the renewable sector, in a sense, right? So if you look at what has happened in the last decade, from effectively 0 gigawatts of renewable energy, we now have almost 200 gigawatts. And a significant amount of that, of course, organizations like NIF have significant investments in renewables, but the foreign capital has come in huge dollops when it comes to a stable policy regime. So yes, stability of policy and positive surprises in policy does attract capital of all hues. And given the fact that India in general has been capital deficient and more importantly, a capital importing country, the fact that you have stable or positively inclined policy changes does tend to attract a lot of capital. I think the contra to this will also be the telecom industry, right? So there have been somewhat of more negative shocks that have come through. And again,
retrospective tax, I think, for instance.
Sorry?
Retrospective tax that came in the telecom.
So a bit of both, right? Both from the executive side as well as from the judicial side, some of the cancellation of the licenses, etc. So when we talk about a policy and we think of maybe government as a behemoth, but the government itself is also three arms. The executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and the three of them institutionally may not necessarily have exactly the same set of policy frameworks or design as they think about it. And sometimes that is just institutional check and balance, which is required between different arms. But when there have been significant policy shocks that have taken place in certain sectors, We've also seen a bunch of foreign players also opt out of the ecosystem. So yes, but that is true. Again, one must reflect back and say whether this is unique to India and the fact that the two of us are deeply invested in the Indian ecosystem and market. We have Indian examples, but but potentially anywhere where there is a positive stability of policy or a positive movement of policy, capital will want to flood in, right? That reduces the cost of capital and potentially creates more opportunity for capital to come in. Yeah. Maybe I'll just take that segue and talk about how I have seen some.
Sure. Please go ahead. Then I think we'll take this Anshuman's very interesting question.
Perfect. But let me just, in a couple of minutes, try and summarize a few things that I've seen investment houses do. Again, if you think about from an investment house perspective, they are in effect battling uncertainty, if you will, at two levels. One is that the sectors that they invest in could potentially see policy changes. And two, at an investment level, there could be, again, some of the macro changes that we've spoken about could come by. And I think 4 or 5 key things that have happened. One is there is a risk premium that gets associated to the cost of capital that comes in. And so when a foreign policy maker or for an investor looks at investing into an emerging market, you end up with slightly higher cost of capital. That becomes a challenge again for a country which is capital importing, but in some sense is the way for the foreign capital to protect itself over a long period of time. Hopefully that higher risk return, the risk premium will potentially get them the sort of return on an average which is useful. The second, and again, we spoke of telecom, the entire gamut of bilateral investment treaties that get signed between countries tend to offer a sense of stability to foreign capital coming in, because between sovereigns there have been agreement to talk of some amount of stability of policy about expropriation or otherwise, etc., etc. And I think that is an important institutional architecture that has been built together, and many countries where you see significant monies coming in from where into India will actually have very strong BITs with India, the bilateral investment treaties with India. The other is if you can't come in fully and you don't want to engage yourself fully as a foreign firm coming in, a local joint venture partner tends to become a much easier way when you learn from the local joint venture partner, let him or her front the sort of policy uncertainty that could potentially be there. And many of those joint venture partnerships are an easier way for foreign firms to come in, learn from the overall ecosystem, and then potentially set their foot here.
No, but a trade-off with such a kind of a joint venture would be that I don't want to be in the joint venture forever. I'd at some point in time spin off on my own. But the local firm would also learn from me. So therefore, I had ended up creating my own competitor at some point in time for the not so very distant future, that I'd like to branch out and be on my own in the country.
That is possible. Like there is also another risk that you take on as a foreign firm, is that if you end up with not the best of partners,
yes,
and there have been many instances of foreign capital actually not ending up with the right promoters, as they are called in India, that can be a challenge for your own investment. Forget about a long-term thing about having created a competitor. But I think it's important for firms to also try and assess whether the market is as big as they thought it would be. Is it as easy to achieve? Is it getting you the right margins and the right return on capital, etc.? So sometimes a joint venture partnership just works. And it's just a more empirical way in which people have tried to reduce their risks. In other cases, what they would do is come on as more passive investors, right? Which is to say, let me get into some liquid investments, learn as neutral observers or more passive observers on the board and see what is happening. And then begin to go out and see whether I want to create something of my own or not.
Interesting. Yeah.
And one other final thing that I would say, many of them actually come in, at least in the infrastructure side that we have seen, is they like to come in at what is called very late stage. When you have the asset which has already been created, the regulatory architecture is in place, the cash flows are kind of obvious, there is political will around the cash flows coming, whether it is on toll roads, whether it is on many of the other sort of infrastructure assets. Foreign capital then wants to come in at a stage where they are saying, okay, a bunch of these things are settled. I'll not get significantly high risk reward for this, but I will get a reasonably consistent cash flow yield on this. That's where you begin to see a lot of foreign firms come in. So both with respect to choice of partners and when you want to come in and in what business models you want to come in begins to get determined for the foreign firms if they have to grapple with uncertainty. But once uncertainty comes down, and again, we've discussed renewables, you can see large sections of large amounts of capital come through in various businesses.
Right. Interesting point about this point of right partners in every sense of the word. If you think about it, Singapore Airlines is partnered with Tata Vistara. Now, thanks to various circumstances that have unfolded, not just the policy uncertainty that is present in civil aviation industry, there's going to be a merger, or there is supposed to be a talk of a merger between Vistara and Air India. Now, the Singapore Airlines wins awards every year for the quality of service that they actually end up providing to people. Air India, well, I mean, let's just leave it at that with a sigh. So therefore, that's going to be an interesting partnership in the light of the changing dynamics of the civil aviation industry itself, which I'm very keen to actually follow, I think. I don't know.
No, this is history turning a full cycle. There is a very famous Lee Kuan Yew story of when Singapore Airlines was being created, that a bunch of people came down and met with JRD Tata to figure out how Air India was being run, because Air India consistently used to win some of those best airline awards in the 70s and 80s. So it's just history in its own circular form. So yes, let's look forward to what...
Let's look forward to that kind of a partnership between ultimately Singapore Airlines and Air India. Okay. Yeah. I think I'll just quickly paraphrase what Anshuman Pal's question is. I was wondering if it is possible that the drop in post-shock sales was caused by inherent structural biases within policy against foreign firms, and not because of any lacuna or unpreparedness by foreign firms. I think it's an interesting question. Maybe there is an inherent policy bias towards promoting DESI, and therefore maybe there is a bias against foreign firms. I really do not know that, but I think the way I'd look at it is, if this were indeed the case, the learning by doing should have no effect on the way they would react to policy uncertainty, right? I mean, if you want to promote only the Indian companies and shun foreign firms, whether you are 50-year-old in India or 30-year-old in India or 10-year-old in India, bones are going to be broken. Very simple argument. The fact that they're learning over a period of time tells me that this is because of policy uncertainty. But a great point nonetheless. I mean, yeah, I don't know what you have views?
No, I'll just add one other element and more an observation of what is happening around the world with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and the previous Republican slogan of "Make America Great Again," and even in in Europe, etc. This whole idea of trying to be slightly more self-reliant in that sense. I think the idea that people want to friendshore, onshore a bunch of things and begin to create jobs back in their own ecosystem. The inherent bias across the world with industrial policy now beginning to favor local firms is a reality that I think many countries are now beginning to face. And so again, I would want to draw that distinction, whether it is just an emerging market scenario of Atmanirbhar, or whether it is MAGA, or whether it is Inflation Reduction Act, etc. I think one needs to take this new reality into account, that maybe going forward, there may be a natural bias for one type of corporate participant as opposed to other. We are yet to see that explicitly called out in policy, but at least again, the Inflation Reduction Act is beginning to create some interesting ripples between the US and EU, for example,
yes,
far more explicitly. So it's worth thinking about it even in larger economies and not just in India.
I mean, as the word recession keeps making more and more headlines, you'll actually have to see that many countries are going to be turning inwards in terms of their policies. They would like to so therefore, this argument of fostering local firms may not be an unanticipated policy response any further going forward. I think it is something that every foreign firm needs to kind of anticipate and be ready for it. Be ready for it in every sense of the word. I think that's the way I would look at as far as policy uncertainty and firm reactions are concerned. But I do believe that this reaction that I at least characterized in the paper would definitely be going to policy uncertainty. There's no reason why learning by doing were to happen, would happen had it been unpreparedness, had it been something which is policy tilt against foreign firms. Vijay has an interesting point, and I'm going to read it out. Anticipating future policy change will be a well-known changes will be well known by local firms than foreign firms due to the known past practical experience besides anything else. This way, local firms can take better next step even in policy uncertainty conditions. Isn't it? That's his question. Answer is yes, of course. I think the reason why local firms tend to do better is because they understand. I mean, I think I'd like to give this analogy. Imagine that you're a cop in a highly crime-prone area. You're always on the alert. On the other hand, you're a cop in a very idyllic situation somewhere where imagine both these places, a small crime were to happen, a small skirmish were to happen. The chances by the first fellow, who is like a cop in the crime-ridden area, his reaction would be fast, quick, clinical, knows how to solve the matter immediately. In the idyllic, the cop in the idyllic world, on the other hand, will probably struggle to figure out how to solve this particular problem because he or she is not prepared for it, in terms of their day-to-day SOPs. So therefore, to that extent, I would actually say this, that this is exactly the domestic firms. No, for instance, maybe the domestic firms have better lobbies, the domestic firms have better political connect, maybe the domestic firms get advanced information. I really do not know what kind of the world it is, but the domestic firms seem to know from the past, even to tackle the kind of policy uncertainties that have not happened in the past, but are uncertain in the nature as they come through from the government. I mean, that will be my understanding. I don't know if you'd like to add anything. Yeah.
No, just a couple of quick points on this. One is the point about engagement with the local ecosystem requires significant amount of time, energy, patience, etc. Again, whether you end up in a developed economy or in a developing economy, again, if I look back at the Indian IT firms trying to figure out how many H-1B visas will open up the next year, that is as much a source of policy uncertainty as is potentially the paragraph 19 here. And if you really want to be a part of the local ecosystem, then you need to spend multiple years and develop those relationships with the policymakers, with the decision makers, etc., and try and talk to them about what actually needs to get done. If you are a new entrant, whether you are a startup and or a foreign policy entrant, a foreign company entrant, a new entrant, in both cases, your access to the ecosystem is somewhat limited. Just simply because you have not focused on access to the ecosystem, the policy making ecosystem, you're just setting up the more basics of either product or distribution or marketing or HR, etc. And so to that extent, you begin to face policy of uncertainty a lot more because you've simply not engaged with the policy ecosystem. If you spend enough time, resources, etc., you become more integrated into the policy ecosystem. So I would think this is more a question of how deeply you as an entity, again, as a foreign entrant or a startup, willing to engage with the policy ecosystem. And that just allows you to imbibe what is in the mind of the policymaker just so much more better and quicker. So that would be my thought on that.
Right. I think we're almost towards the end. So therefore, I think that's where we will stop anyway. So any final thoughts, Shivendra or Arvind?
I think we have answered all the questions. I look forward to Professor Sahai to contribute his views.
Excellent conversation, I thought. The only one point that I would probably build a little bit on is on the point that Akhilesh made, where he said the government consists of the executive, legislature, and judiciary as the three arms. In my experience, the executive itself is composed of 1,001 arms. And very frequently, the 1,001 arms have very little idea of what's going on in some of the other arms. And the coordination between the different arms is very, very slow, if I can use that word. And maybe it is partly to do with being cautious about the checks and balances and in the decision-making process. However, from direct experience, where the government is engaged in either running a business or is engaged in sponsoring market infrastructure institutions, this leads to delays in the decision-making process, which have a deleterious impact on the companies in question. So that to me is a significant part of the policy uncertainty that happens in practice. And arguably, this affects both equally, foreign firms as well as Indian firms. Having said that, some Indian firms, I would argue, are a little more prepared for this because they are familiar with the process, and perhaps or let me rephrase that, some firms in some industries are better able to manage that process. And foreign firms, by and large, unless they have been here for a while, and this goes back to the point about developing relationships and understanding how the process works in the government, those are the firms which are able to perhaps better handle the process. The newer ones will get tripped every once in a while because they are not completely au fait with the process. But, excellent conversation, excellent insights from the paper, from the conversation. And I'm really happy from the NSE CBS perspective that we were able to have this event, which is thrown some light on this entire process. And I hope that there is some further work on this particular area. Hint, hint, Vishy and Akhilesh.
Thank you.
For sure. Thank you for having us here.
Absolutely. Thanks for the final thought. I think the coordination issue that you talked about is pertinent, not just between the three arms of the government, but also the 1001 Kali that you have with the executive itself. I mean, there's an interesting, I thought I'm the world's biggest cynic, but there's one cynic that has actually asked a question which basically goes something like, is it possible that domestic firms lobby for policy uncertainty? Answer is probably not. Even they are worried about policy uncertainty. Probably they're a little less worried about policy uncertainty than the foreign firms are. But boy, that was the first thought that came to me at some point in time.
No, be careful what you wish for, because if you wish for policy uncertainty, you have no idea what can come and hit you.
What can come in, yeah, of course.
So
on that note, yeah.
Thanks, guys, again.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, Akhilesh.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Arvind.
Thanks, Vishy. Love the show.
Thank you.